Hello everyone, how are you doing? Welcome to tonight's discussion, the climate catastrophe the world ignores, the Tibet Climate Crisis and Chinese colonialism. This panel discussion was organized by Students for Free Tibet with the support of the International Tibet Network, Free Tibet UK, the International Campaign for Tibet Germany, and Indian Collective. So my name is Tenzin Chidun. I'm a SFT campaigns intern, and I'll be the moderator for tonight. Before we start, I'd like for us to observe a moment of silence for frontline climate defenders, not just Tibetans, but those everywhere around the world. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. So a bit of housekeeping, before we start. Firstly, please make sure your phones are on silent mode. Secondly, if you need to leave for any reason, please make sure you do so after a speaker is finished. And lastly, masks are required for the full duration of the event if possible. If not, that's okay. And actually, there's one last thing as well. There are no fire alarm scheduled for today, but if so, the fire exit is just through that door all the way to the front. Thank you. So as a reminder, but I'm sure our panelists tonight will illustrate it better than myself, Tibet is on the front line of the global climate crisis. It is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the Earth. And it is known as the world's third pole because it holds the largest store of fresh water outside of the Arctic poles. Thus, it is providing water, food security, and ultimately survival for at least 1.4 billion people across Asia. So the goal of today's discussion, as its title indicates, is to shed light on a critical component of the Tibet climate crisis that is more often than not overlooked. Indeed, China's occupation of Tibet is at the core of environmental mismanagement on the Tibetan plateau. This is exemplified by the CCP's extensive hydrodamming and mineral extraction, which combined with climate change impacts threaten to destroy Tibet's unique ecosystems and is currently responsible for Tibet's unprecedented meltdown. To discuss more thoroughly the intersections of climate change and colonization, we are pleased and honored to hear from 4 expert panelists here tonight. Starting with Tenji Chukila. Tenji Chukila is a senior researcher for Tibet Watch, a research and advocacy organization which monitors Tibetan, English, and Chinese government websites and media. It also collects and corroborates information for human rights violations inside Tibet. Next, we have Sai Wagner, who is the creative resistance coordinator at the NDN Collective, an indigenous-led grassroots organization dedicated to empowering indigenous peoples and creating sustainable solutions. He's also the board member of the Indigenous Peoples Power Project. Pema Dumala is the campaigns director at Students for Free Tibet International, a Tibetan-led grassroots organization dedicated to amplifying Tibetan voices inside Tibet through direct action, national and international-led advocacy and grassroots training. Last but not least, Golojing Mela, who is a human rights defender, former political prisoner, and possibly the most significant Tibet activist to reach the international community since the Tibetan uprising in 2008. He was arrested 3 times for his activist work and subjected to torture before escaping Tibet in 2014. Since reaching exile, he has consistently continued his activism for Tibet, including before international institutions such as the UN Human Rights Council. Next to him, Dr. Gyal studies international security at University of Edinburgh, and he also produces a very interesting podcast called Intelligence Tibet, which seeks to make discussion on Tibetan current affairs and politics accessible in Tibetan language. He will be interpreting for Golojing Mela tonight. Before we dive into the actual discussion, Pema is going to give a basic overview of Tibet for those of you who are maybe not familiar with its history.
Are we using the mic situation with that mic or this mic? I should have asked this one.
Either will do, because they both work.
Awesome, thank you. Hi everyone. So as Junla mentioned, we're just gonna begin with a really brief overview of a little bit of basic Tibetan history so that we are all on the same page for the rest of the discussion this evening. So Tibetan people are a nomadic and Buddhist society today, and the Tibetan Buddhist culture, which is what Tibet's largely known for, has existed for several thousand years, close to 3,000 or 4,000 years. And inside Tibet, the nomadic culture, the pastoral way of life, has actually been a part of Tibetan culture for over 8,000 years. So today, the society inside Tibet is largely influenced by both of those factors, both the pastoralism as well as the Buddhist influence. And that really defines the identity and culture of Tibetan people today. It also unifies them a lot. And so in the 1940s or so, late 1940s and 1949, China began entering Tibet. And by 1959, China had a full military occupation of Tibet. During the occupation of Tibet, tens of thousands of Tibetans fled into exile following His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. And since then, Tibetans have lived inside Tibet as well as in exile, largely in the foothills of the Himalayas, in Dharamsala, Nepal, and increasingly so in other countries where, as there are very little opportunities for advancement, education, and also high levels of censorship, increasingly so in areas like Nepal, you also have increasing numbers of Tibetans living in exile in different countries outside of Asia as well. And the map that you can see is the map of Tibet prior to its occupation. And this map actually accounts for approximately 1/4 of China's entire landmass under today's political map. And what China claims as like Tibet today would be the kind of like the Tibetan Autonomous Region, which is TAR. But prior to its occupation, Tibet was also made up of its other areas. So, for example, like my family is from Amdo, and if you think about Amdo, that it would be where it says Qinghai, and that wouldn't even be counted within the Tibetan Autonomous Region, as with like Golojing Mela as well, for example. So you can see the Golok TAP, that's like where Golojing Mela would be from. And so China has actually, during its initial occupation, annexed Tibet into several different territories as a means of kind of controlling and dividing up the people of Tibet into smaller pockets of land. And so the Tibetan Autonomous Region largely comprises of mainly what was the Uzang region of Tibet before. And so there's also Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan regions of Tibet, regions of China, which are historically also areas of Tibet. And so that's kind of a little bit of an overview of the previous history. More recently, in 1989, there were uprisings in Tibet. Also in 2008, So there have been many times when Tibetans have risen up, but in 2021, Tibet was ranked as the least free country or territory in the world by Freedom House, an independent, nonpartisan watch group. And so it's increasingly very challenging for Tibetans inside Tibet. Sorry, it was ranked most least free country or territory in the world alongside Syria. So they both had the same freedom score. So that means that virtually there is no space for political or civil freedom for Tibetans inside Tibet to have any sort of opposition to the Chinese Communist Party regime. Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks to you, Pamela. So now, to kick off our discussion, Dengzi Chukila will give us a brief introduction to the Tibet Climate Crisis to ensure that all attendees have a basic understanding of the situation on the ground.
Thank you. So now that we know how administratively Tibet was divided and incorporated into Chinese provinces, we now have to remember the scale of Tibetan land, and that's 2.5 million square kilometers and 2% of land surface area. That means that the impact of climate crisis in Tibet will ripple across the downstream nations and Asia and the interconnected global weather systems as well. The disproportionate effect of climate crisis in Tibet is just like how it happens in the North and South Poles, which means that it's warming 2 to 4 times faster than the global average. And because it holds the largest amount of fresh water outside the North and South Poles, it means that Tibet is also known as the water tower of Asia. The largest river systems originate from Tibet, and they flow into Pakistan, to Nepal, to India, to Bangladesh, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. So we see how important Tibet is at the center of Asia's water and food security. And alongside the rivers, Tibet is encircled by snow mountains. And there is also ground ice, permafrost, which also thaws with a warming temperature. This means that for Tibetans living inside Tibet, and to actually cite an example, Tibetans living in Lhasa have reported in research reports that the heat will soon become unbearable. So that is the effect of global heating inside Tibet. And you can imagine how it must be for poor and vulnerable who live in the margins of the society and who are also dependent on state subsidies. And we have to remember that the state is the Chinese government. So that is the climate crisis in Tibet, with melting glaciers, melting snow mountains, and the permafrost thawing, which will affect the downstream nation and also the water and food security of Asia. That's a brief overview. We have actually to connect the scientific facts to how we will take the framework of a poem to look at how Tibetans inside Tibet experience the climate crisis. This poem is written by Lobsang Pandrup. His pen name is Dilhaven. He was arrested in 2019, arbitrarily detained, and there was no reason given for his arrest. After a year, on 4th December 2020, his family received an official message informing them to appear before the court. No decision was taken, and his family decided to keep this information secret until now, because they hoped that he would be released. But because there was no information, no access to fair trial, his family now fears for his life and now have shared this information to sources in exile. And to honor the courageous risk that Tibetan artists and poets take inside occupied Tibet, I would like to read his poem. This is indeed related to climate crisis. I'm going to take the freedom of, as a Tibetan living outside Tibet, to interpret his poem and relate it to climate crisis. There are many references to sun mountain yak, which is the domesticated animal of the Tibetan nomads. There's also surveillance, history, education, service to your own people, and freedom in the end. All of this is explained through a poem, and let me read it to you. It's translated also by a Tibetan poet, writer, and translator in exile, Poaching. So there's a cross collaboration between poets inside and outside Tibet. Do you know the tales of our forefathers by Dilharden, translated by Poaching. To my knees, Kamzum. Before the sun's rays hit the smiling peaks, you're ready to hit the road. Following the hoofs of yaks singing a sad song, with the day's provisions stored in the fold of your chupa, this is when my heart turns weak like tunes of your song. If you have to spend your life on the plateau like animals in the wild, I never want to say farewell and leave. Instead, if I can turn you into a student holding a book and a pen, will you be a girl in the service of our country? Will you be a woman who loves her people? Let me ask you, do you know the troubled tales of your forefathers? Did you see their footprints in the mountains you roam? Do you recognize the mountain peak where your forefathers' vital blood dissolved? Write this single word called freedom on the mountain peak where your forefathers have shed tears for livelihood and sacrificed their lives for their rights. This will be your first proof to be with the people of the world on an equal footing.
Thank you so much, Chukila, for this very clear and concise overview of the Tibet Climate Crisis, and also for sharing this beautiful and powerful poem. I think it touched everyone's heart, whether it is tonight in the audience in person or those watching us live. So now that we've heard some of the key scientific facts about the Tibet climate crisis, we are very lucky to actually hear a first-hand perspective of the lived experiences of Tibetans living under the Chinese government's occupation from Colonialism.
다시 내가 어떤 대한민국의 고통 대한 고통을 같은 게 제죠. 맞춰서 조정 거 움직이는 야말 소정 거나 통성 조정 조직신들 조건 인터넷 탈진의 것들 예산이 특강식도 교체를 용하여 이 본연에서 가장 많아요. 강력이 높이 된 동미인데 것들 대표가 아직까지 내려가요.
Hello everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you all. I'm a former political prisoner. My name is Colonialism. I was imprisoned 3 times by the Chinese Communist Party. Consequently, my life was endangered and I managed to escape by unfolding the shackles. I have a long story to tell about my life in prison. However, my book, my biography is coming soon, which contains the details of my life in prison.
대한민국들 업사지 소대 에사이 첨졌다. 장난 그 넥스바 오지 노트가니라 야나가 마르종네 어떻습지 세치 락터 따때 도식 통점바 속고네 내설냥 디샤지엔.
The main thing that I'm going to talk today is how Chinese Communist Party is destroying Tibetan environment, which is well known as Asia's water tower and the third pole of the world.
옛날 자정거 맞수 오지 내려졌죠. 안내 맞춘 소 내려졌던 상황에 일까 어딘가는 롱동소 내려 걱정을 주지요. 예전 내려졌던 람소 자친 마보 돌락 피했던 시기예요.
For example, Chinese government is extracting mineral resources from minerals popular and sacred Tibetan mountains such as Abhimanyu, making them completely empty inside and destroying uncountable holy mountains and places.
동호 동서 망부랑 나주 원미 랑창 망명에 암도 튜사크 소 스테이션 낙서 스타친 때다 따다 남메 방위촌 도나 원사 용라 스테이션 낙서 속 사치위 개무 파치와 따급 혈мет다 땅즈요.
Moreover, forests and plants that has been touched, that has never been touched by humans are now destroyed without a trace. This is clearly exemplified in Tevo, in Amdo. In brief, most of the forests and rare plants are destroyed.
다동 마체당 러시아 야롱 선보소 워티 초 침보 몽골 처럼 라면 야파당 체체니 카 아잔당 아잔다 갑쇼결 점바 소라텐 천점라 네비 정동 마소지 두 템치 결정 몽골라 삽지 어머니 되요.
Moreover, various dams are constructed along the great rivers of Tibet, such as Yangtze, Brahmaputra, and Yellow River. Also, due to the changing the directions of the major rivers, cause dangerous damages and problems in the neighboring countries, and as well as the Tibetan farmers and nomads settled alongside the rivers.
원머리지 다무 샤이르 암동 소몽보 소친 초쇼자무 수 소당 제거망보 도시 언노견 나쪽 봉진요 텐션 사치 르키 소착 라면 겐자파 소노 조티마랑.
Furthermore, Tibetan sacred lakes like Blue Lake in Amdo Chongon, which is also known as Tishor Gyalmo, and many other small lakes were severely harmed. Likewise, various endangered Tibet species are now extinct.
사드테랑 더 무서 제제식나 워티 조빈 소아당 코리바지 베베 코리안 만남 록츠식이엔 냐 시바 총리 때문에 로빈 코리크 호수 촌니 날소바엔 조디 소아당 라오숑 코리바 라오숑 코리바라 데와 가나 요바는 막소 로바츠 사로시지요. 로비 고식지 코리가 몬서체 판토당
Particularly today, I'm going to focus on the situations of Tibet nomads and their relationship with the environment. I was born in a nomadic family and grew up in a traditional nomadic society. We know the special relationships between the nomadic life and natural environment inside out. Nomadic cattle have extraordinary benefit to protect the natural environments.
혼자 방터 야마르 소종기 젠전 장메터 워킹 로봇 수랑네 자사 잠초다 로봇 마소 로사닌 등 먹지빨 로봇 통들자라 게테 야오종 이 마소 워킹 로봇 게노스트진 요퍼텐 타타네 원 톨병근 지득자기 메토크 열롱다 장독 자독 코리 용속 시에탕 따른 열좀 바탕 아니 마천 거마로서 거마로다 원 톨병근 혈음남 제스 잼tok 쳔바라 마즈 몰라 때문 때부터 좀 마음냥에 전열와다 초로 양양 디바소 코리 자tak까는 로리진 제만도 진들.
However, CCP has forcibly taken all the grasslands from the nomads without hesitation, and by kicking nomads from the nomadic grasslands and resettled in the cities. Hence, the extinctions of traditional nomadic culture, consequently, the beautiful Tibetan meadows and valleys that are adorned and in enchanted flowers are now turned into deserts. The deglaciations of Tibetan mountains, including Agni is faster than ever, and also landslide and floods are happening more frequently in places that has never happened, that had never experienced such natural disasters. Therefore, Tibet climate situation is urgent in recent years.
자작 안에서 너덕나 자마르 소중 월라 팀네 롱걸 벤치랑 공수 마초 월라 잡힌 탐이 고쳐다 마초 함가 체슈데 온정 모사메테 자정근 장롱 용라 어디 야기 땅 요지 다동 장롱 머멍 워커 똥땅 똥진 요 가서 에샤이 체친 파르치빈 종콩다 장랑거 네 선버 잡베 럼토 사상자 저상 마르다 람숑 텔타 나소기 통콩 파섬 속에 원 토경거 코리가 야므르 소정거 노파타 바티 파미 섹션나 이 에샤이 사크르 용어다 세상이 장랑 셜라 토포 가다 템기 연바는 마수 시비니
These urgent environmental situations are the results of Chinese occupations of Tibet in last 7 decades. This is a massive loss of Tibet, yet CCP is promoting deceptive propagandas of development in Tibet to the world. Tibet's third pole is also known as water tower of Asia, a source of major rivers of downstream countries, rich minerals, high mountains, and clean airs. Tibet climate change affects the Asia's climate change and wider urgent climate crisis in the globalized world.
데이터리 다티 워킹 코링 자적 내통도 송쪽 셰퍼 네트브랑 마초 강을 강성 사딩이야. 그러나 네장 워킹 코링 송쪽 당 로미 토탄 쳇 레가 시브르텐 마 워트 요코 야머지 갈라 강을 타파 원장 강을 강라지 연양 대라 가수 동림 시두바 마르토 강을 요츠라 동림 셰퍼 강을 득지 가수 셈점네 다나 마초 먹고 마치 바리
Chinese government CCP continues destroying Tibetan environment in Tibet. For example, due to the active participation in the climate activism and human rights advocates, Chinese government imprisoned and tortured me. Despite all these challenges, we need to advocate and work on the climate crisis in Tibet.
Tibetan terangni jamarji zanu oko wodma yongzogdang wodi chapsa tomba yongzogdi tsabchidi chen namla riwajidina jamar sojong gon dongam dang yordi hamchi khoni wodi nokchid yongzog toshik tsabchang tongjin dajak kanetang de chen namji marjet par dala dajak dongam shepshok tablim nitin ji laktar devrog je tena ngatu rekriyen 학다 야마르 소정고 관절 설득이 요것도 맞추 피르기를 용다 학다 냠들 결속 예수 자마 또든 결속 각 자정고 관절 소지 요것도 맞췄다 냠들 결속 속 또든 결속 순간 체점 지로 지 냥리 레크르시 집전요
Therefore, on behalf of Tibetans under the Chinese occupations and political prisoners, I would like to put forward the following requests. I would like to urge you to remember Tibet's environmental issues and particularly climate change problems faced around the world. I would also like to ask for your support and not fall under the influence of Chinese deceptive economic power. I would also sincerely urge United Nations and powerful countries to take bigger responsibilities on environmental issues.
Counter dati tinder working korika nertangda timber zaman ko korik songchok sola shog yoni dajak kangar charjin yopa marto tatong atsu shigyamna atsu riwaji yopare kate dati dajak tinder atsu namit tangna ti jigde nyanchi atsor riwaji sa mepaji jongi yende tertar jongmanna atsu shirgir yongi gan chetam kar thamanda Тогда тарти нямбер ямсог ji su mangso tang changden la kha shabe zamang tokden jerto khaki lagna yopari.
In any case, although the climate change in the world, and particularly in Tibet, has arrived in a critical time, we still have hope to protect. If we ignore the current urgent climate crisis, it will push us to a point where we cannot do anything. Whether we reach this critical situation or not is entirely in our hand, in the hand of us, the people and the powerful liberal democratic countries and United Nations.
Karte tarti nямбер ямсog ji su zamang tokden jerto khaki atsu yotsat anirtuk ji kwamjor kepan chansak rela jiu jamnano nin teni dong atso la rewa chiang meper jirzamba rela terang tam songdan dartawal layang tongde chiang marshomari tertem tenji nertang chowo ji ngator jong mulgubi chet ta ni rektor tam molom jibje tar samala tiji chejayo.
If all the powerful countries and United Nations will exchange these environmental issues with minor economic benefit, then we have already lost our hope. This would also take in the conferences such as today's conference meaningless. I therefore would like to request and aspire in order not to face such big climate crisis in future. Thank you for coming and listening to my life experience on climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guruji Milatuchina. After everything that you have personally endured, you're still here, still standing against the Chinese government and amplifying the voices of fellow Tibetan activists inside Tibet. I think it's safe to say that you are truly a hero for all of us who care about human rights and the environment. I would now like to bring the discussion to the other panelists and see if we can add more context to the lived experiences of activists inside and outside Tibet. Starting with Chukila. Chukila, as we mentioned earlier, you are a researcher for Tibet Watch, and you engage in projects to collect raw data from inside Tibet and provide reports and findings, which are in turn used to strengthen advocacy, activist work led by Tibetans in exile. Hearing from Guruji Mela's story, how do you think these types of experiences impact the work of Tibet Watch around climate change specifically? And what are the main issues that Tibetans inside Tibet are concerned about currently with regards to climate policies initiated by the Chinese government?
The experiences that Guruji Mela shared are vital for us to hear, because since 2008, the overwhelmingly peaceful protests that erupted across Tibet, as well as the at least 159 self-immolations that happened inside Tibet, are still not kind of forgotten in the media. So it is important to have experiences of Guruji Mela to be heard directly outside Tibet. These experiences are connected to Tibet Watch's work in a way that Tibet Watch is reliant on courage of Tibetans inside Tibet to share the information. Many of them go through a lot of risk in sharing this information. They sometimes, as I explained earlier, the case of Dil Hadin, they only shared it fearing in the end that he's no longer alive. So families living inside Tibet have to wait for days and days and days, hoping that their family would be released. And then once they feel like nothing's happening, they take another level of risk to share it in exile. So Tibetans inside Tibet are really important in sharing the facts on the ground. And one of the facts related to climate crisis that is happening inside Tibet is the issue of resettlement, which Poaching explained earlier. In the eastern Eastern Tibet, there's an area of nature reserve called Sanjian 1. In Tibetan, it is Majizasum, that's the headwaters of Machu, Dishu, and Zachu, Tibetan names we must remember. There were at least 55,000 Tibetans who were resettled from those river areas because they were drying up. And that is what climate crisis is. The impact that was felt for Tibetans was that they were relocated from those areas, not just 1-2 kilometers, but hundreds of kilometers. And now, this year, there was an earthquake in one of the resettlement villages in Madhya County, and children of those resettled, or let me say forcefully evicted Tibetans, they had to be transferred to a temporary post-earthquake school. So that's the impact of climate crisis. You have drying up of the river sources, Tibetan nomads being resettled, and then an earthquake happens, and then the children are sent away. And parents are worried that the Tibetan children will not get an education. So this is what it is like for Tibetans in the ground to live climate crisis on a day-to-day basis. You see policies like resettlement, which are implemented without the inclusion of Tibetan voices. You have the surveillance, which if the Tibetans inside Tibet share information, they put their lives at their own risk. And then you also have the uncertainty, which increases in frequency and intensity. And that's how Tibetans inside Tibet live. But then they still do share information to the outside world that we need to pay attention to. I think that's.
Thank you for the insightful answer, Chukila. And thank you for all the work that you and the Tibet Watch team are doing, especially the members of Tibet Watch that are, risking their lives every single day on the ground. Your work is truly, I think, the crucial link between Tibetans inside Tibet and Tibetan activists in exile. I think that without your work, Tibetan activism would be incomplete. I want to ask the next question to our panelist, Sai. Sai, you're not only an indigenous climate activist at the forefront of many ongoing campaigns and initiatives on Turtle Island, but you've also actually had the chance to work with many Tibet activists and youth through direct action and resistance training spaces. As the topic of tonight's discussion reveals, and as we've seen through the stories of our two previous panelists, occupation and colonization play a major role in the lived experiences of communities at the front lines of climate change. I think you may know a thing or two about occupation and colonization. And as an indigenous campaigner, were there any specific aspects of Colonialism and Tindichukila's experiences and research that particularly resonated with you? And secondly, have you noticed any similarities and or differences in the intersection of climate change and colonization within the spaces you organize with in Turtle Island, and the brief reflections that you've heard so far tonight?
Okay, so Khalid is Nalsagi. Thank you for listening, for those online and those physically here. Yes, it's a very, very complex topic, and thinking about this, it's really hard to pinpoint what to talk about and where to start, because the situation in Tibet right now has happened in multiple places in my own people, my relatives around, in a country in the United States who fails to tell the story of these moments, and as if nothing has happened, or as if everything is all right. So we take it amongst ourselves to tell those stories and come to these places and have our history being heard, because it can't be ignored. The answers for the leaders and the decision makers in power right now have completely been guiding us in a direction that's pretty much self-destruction. And some of the answers for the state of wildfires in Brazil, fires. There's a fire season in California. It's kind of a crazy thing to think about, that now we have a fire season. And the very water I used to drink as a young boy growing up is no longer in the water tables that resided in the deserts that I live. And I come from a place, on my father's side of the family is a place called Bird Springs. It's named after the little birds water at City 12. And then my mother's from the area where is another place where the sun shines through the water. So there's water places in these deserts have resided. You can't find these places on maps, but these are places that were a life source. And in order to have a very just transition and change, the understanding of land and individual and people is very important. And so one of our campaigns is pushing the narrative of land back. And you probably heard that a few times. So it's basically asking for the answer to climate justice is to give land back to the people, the original holders of the land, and have indigenous people run those lands. And so again, fire in California, the forest was managed by indigenous people there, right? And now, like, it's uncontrollable. Utility companies are just setting it on fire, and there's a lot of profit out of that. It's crazy to hear that. So the answers reside within Tibetans, within indigenous peoples on their lands, and I think a lot of people are starting to understand and starting to listen. And it's been my job to push these narratives out there as an activist or as a creative resistance coordinator to help tell these stories visually. Maybe on social media, you got less than 10 seconds to tell your story. So I put with SFT and some Tibetans and other groups and movements, we've created a network of people where we have multiple brains to help guide these narratives and put them out into the mainstream. And so, and strategically placing different forms of strategic tactics of direct action in combination with the campaigns that we're running, and which is how my world and the Students for Free Tibet's world has intersected. And from that, we've created this relationship where there's a lot of similarities. How my people hold the mountains sacred. And in the very, very same mountains for Tibetan people, where we just heard that it's water supply for like nations. And so there's a mutual understanding of that, how like it's not a resource, it's a way of life. And so if people can't understand that, then there is no solution. And so my heart goes out to people who are in exile, people who are no longer with us, to carry these traditions on, and teaching the younger folks and having these circles and having these dialogues and educating ourselves. So and plugging in to see where we can support.
Thank you so much, Sai, for your beautiful answer and for joining us here tonight, for your support of the Tibetan cause. And I think your answer truly shows how crucial traditional indigenous knowledge is for climate justice worldwide. And I think that your work and the Indian Collective's work is truly inspiring in that sense, especially how you focus on narrative transformation, which is, I think, a very important pathway to change the way people see climate justice and understand it. I want to pose my next question for Pamela. As a Tibetan American, you're a campaigner working with many other Tibetans on human rights issues inside Tibet. But as a student in the US, you also worked on local and national level climate campaigns since the time you were in high school. So not so long ago, but maybe. Most world leaders and climate activists from developed countries have very little understanding, I think, of the intersection of climate change and colonization and occupation. So, as we have been discussing this very intersection, do you think there's a link between these seemingly isolated climate narratives and discourses? And if so, what are those links?
Thanks, Jillian, for the question. I think that when it comes to thinking about climate change, over the past years, the way that people think about climate change and see climate change has really shifted. I think initially, it started with this campaign that was like, recycle and you're going to save the world. And I think that was a narrative that a lot of people had for a long time because that was a narrative that kind of benefited those in power, that made people think that the world could be saved with, small changes to your everyday life, 5-minute fixes. But I think that when you think about what really causes climate change on a deeper level, you think about what shifted some point in a human history where we went from being a place where this earth gave so much to us, and then suddenly we became this place where there were climate emergencies and catastrophes happening in every corner of the world, and where the brightest scientists of the entire world, would tell us things like, by the time this date happens, or by the time that date happens, these are going to be your climate realities. And this is it's kind of strange because this is the time that people from my generation have really grown up with. When we were very little, we did the whole reuse, recycle thing. And now we're adults and we're like, oh wow, we did our best, but suddenly the world's also going to end in like a couple decades. And of course, like, it's not to over sensationalize what's happening with climate change, but I think if you think about the actual root of where that shift actually happened, I think about like my ancestors or the people of Tibet for many years before, or the Tibetan nomads, who are the indigenous people of Tibet that have stewarded the lands really and have a deep connection with the land. As I mentioned earlier, for the past 8,000 years, I think about the fact that like since 1980s, over 1 million Tibetan nomads have actually been relocated. So, Chukila shared the story about the 55,000, but there's also been that same story happening everywhere around Tibet in the past several decades. And I think that there's actually, it's not just a one-way street. It's not just that climate change impacts those that are colonized. I think that those that are colonized also can impact climate change in the reverse as well. So what I mean by that is we think that those that are colonized are facing two oppressions, the oppression of colonization and also the oppression of climate change. And that's, as a frontline community, we want to see how we can hear their voices. And so one way that I could explain this is in the 2019 IPCC report about the cryosphere and glaciers, there was this finding that came out that says that even if 1.5 is kept alive, over a third of Tibet's glaciers will be gone by the end of the century. And that's a shocking figure. And the fact is that if 1.5 isn't kept alive, if we continue in our current trends, then actually 2/3 of Tibet's glaciers will be gone before the end of my life, possibly, if I'm lucky enough to have a full life. And then the fact that this is happening, but the people who live in those regions, the Tibetan nomads, the ones that find the glaciers sacred and have nurtured them and protected them for thousands of years, are nowhere in the conversation. They're not at the negotiation table. They're not at the rallies even, because they can't get a passport, many of them, because of the colonization. So that's the one side of it that I think might be more clear to understand. And the other side of it, though, is those that are colonized, it also impacts climate change because it speeds up the rate of climate change as well. It actually impacts every person in the world. So Tibet is actually a carbon sink. The grasslands in Tibet is so vast that it actually soaks up greenhouse gases and carbon from the environment that other countries like China, the world's largest carbon emitter, have put out that heat up the planet. So actually, the lands that Tibetans have stored have not only speed up climate change, but actually slow down climate change. And pastoral way of life, pastoralism has been scientifically proven to actually help keep the grasslands healthy. So I think it's no coincidence that we've seen, widespread desertification, which is caused by melting permafrost, but also sped up by the fact that there isn't, the amount of nomads that are grazing the lands has decreased by over 1 million in the past several decades. And you also see other examples of that, like, for example, the fact that because the Chinese Communist Party wants to colonize and hold a tight grasp on Tibet, they also don't allow researchers inside Tibet. And we can see that ends up resulting in, so we had a talk with a glaciologist the other day who actually said that there's not enough research right now to know when those climate catastrophes will start harming people in downstream nations, when the food shortages that provide food security for more than half of the world's population, more than 4 billion people rely on food, agricultural outputs from Tibet's waters. More than 20% of the world relies on Tibet's rivers. And there isn't enough research right now to know when those rivers might start flooding, when they may start drying up, when that will impact the agricultural seasons, when food shortages will happen, when there'll be, crises where rivers dry up and there'll be mass, like climate refugees, mass migration of climate refugees. Like, because of the colonization of Tibet, it's actually speeding up the rate of climate change and also reducing the resiliency of nations to adapt and, reduce human suffering to prevent climate catastrophes. So there is a very real risk that climate change has posed on those that are colonized, but the colonization itself has also posed many extremely, unthinkable risks onto the speed of climate change and also the damage and suffering that will be caused by that climate change in the coming decades and coming centuries. So I think that's kind of like the link that I'll just talk about for now.
Thank you, Angela. And I wanted to personally thank you for being such a great role model for us young Tibetans in exile who are striving to become better forces for positive change for our community. So thank you so much for both your answers and what you represent. So we have heard a little bit from all of our panelists tonight. I would like to encourage our audience here in person, as well as our viewers watching live, to consider any questions you have for our panelists. But before that, I would like to pose a question of my own that I've prepared. So we have been discussing tonight, again, the intersection of colonization and climate change. But for some of our attendees or viewers who weren't familiar or hadn't grappled this topic prior to tonight, this may still feel like a vague, ambiguous intersection. So can you please, each of you, highlight one example of the intersection of colonization and climate change that you have either experienced, witnessed, or researched, please? Whoever would like to start.
I think the clear link between colonialism and climate change is that when Tibet was colonized by China, Tibet has lost the country, and we know that human activities caused climate change. It's human-induced climate change, and that there is a lack of political will to address these deep systemic issues. So for Tibetans, who is that political leadership? It's China. It's not Tibetan leadership. And when Tibetan in exile approach the governments of the world, all of them shy away from the economic power of China. And they do not see that it has come at the cost of eroding the democracy that they are saying that they're upholding. And the other relation, obviously, is that there are always the extractive companies that capitalize on natural resources, and they just seek profit, and they are dependent on greed. They do not address the real value systems that indigenous stewardship convey to the world that we live in. So it is there is a clear relation between colonial powers, capitalism, and the economy. And we know that there are many natural resources inside Tibet, lithium, which are used in batteries and electric buses. So, and it is almost a lived knowledge that nobody has to teach everyone that there are many products made in China. It's almost like, let's say, a very dangerous indigenous knowledge. But yeah, we have to really address at what cost is the economic power of China coming, and also the extractive companies that seek to, erode our way of looking and living and with the land and water, all these resources based on which they produce the commodities that we buy and sell.
Well said. I think starting this conversation, I think for the question, I'd like to start off by saying the word known as environmental racism. If you haven't heard this before, it is a real thing. And here's an example of that is, I live back home in Arizona, and within that nation where I live, we have coal-fired power plants. And there's several. I don't need to give any numbers or statistics, but they power Las Vegas, they power California, they power several other states, they power the big metropolis of Phoenix, Arizona, and its neighboring rich cities, and its fountains, and its water, and its swimming pools. And next to these power plants, my people live without power, without in I went through high school doing my homework in a lamp at night. I had like 4 of them running, and there was no electricity. I thought it was a pretty normal thing. And but those are examples of like indigenous people being taken advantage of. The year of COVID, 2020, was a very sad time. That was one of my best highlights to see anything in that year, was to see the Navajo Generating Station, power plant that fed all these places that I just talked about, fall to the ground. Like, it went out of business. It was. I mean, they're not going to stick around and clean it up, but that is no longer burning coal and no longer extracting those resources from our community. But unfortunately, our leaders look for solutions that are like, oh, let's think about nuclear power since it's clean. And so, like, they lack the education, they lack the guidance of true leadership of what like a real transition would be. Fracking is another answer. Natural gas is another answer. These are like destructive practices, right? And then the push for like electric cars, like, where are all these resources going to come? And also, where are these wastes going to go? And so we have our relatives in Utah who are fighting nuclear waste that's being put into their areas for decades now. And it's just a messy scene. It's a messy responsibility that we are put into. And I think environmental racism is a really clear understanding of like how things are happening. Because, when you turn on your iPhone, like, you don't see that, right? But the communities in the front lines are the ones that are tasting it in their mouth. They're sitting in the waste that we've created, right? It's in their front yards, it's in their backyards, it's in their DNA. There's people that are born that don't even have a chance to have cancer. And it's because we have this addiction to these products that we are pushing in the world. So that's an example I want to share.
Thank you, Sai. Kita I think that the example of the intersection of colonization and climate change that I wanted to share is kind of different. I just wanted to share like an example of like one specific person's story. There's a Tibetan climate person. I actually wouldn't call him a climate activist because he's a Tibetan nomad. So activism is not what he's doing. It's protecting the land is just his identity. He's not engaging in activism. He's just engaging in his culture. So there's a Tibetan nomad named Anya Sangda, and him and his brother noticed that in their community there was a lot of government corruption, and that corruption included things like extractive mining without permits. So things that the government would never, report to other countries that they're doing. And they noticed that there was also illegal poaching of endangered species. So I feel like for me, the intersection is I come to a place like Glasgow right now during COP26 and I hear about mining at protests. At protests, people speak about, illegal mining. And I go into the event, into COP26, and you hear about biodiversity and how that's building a resilient future. And then I think about the fact that there's no Tibetan nomads in Glasgow right now because they can't come here. But inside Tibet, Tibetan nomads are the ones that are actually telling these truths to the powers that are doing these things, that are like committing these crimes. And what they did was they created a local grassroots group where they would, do petitions to try to reduce government corruption on a local level. And so Anya's brother, Jim 3, and him were both arrested, and Jim 3, Anya's brother, has already died in detention. And Anya right now is still sitting inside jail. So for me, I think the intersection, like one example of an intersection of colonization and climate change is that there are people, so-called world leaders, so-called climate activists who come to events like COP26 and talk about these things. But then there are also frontline defenders like nomads who are, risking their lives, who are, Anya's been in jail he hasn't seen freedom for several years now. And on Earth Day, it was actually the date of his appeal to have his court case reheard. And while the whole world was on, social media and talking on the news about sustainability and Earth Day, Anya's, right to his appeal was denied, and he had to wait for his appeal several more months, which was later denied, actually. So I think for me, that's like a really clear example of how colonization and climate change can intersect, because people like Anya should be, treated as heroes because they're the ones that are truly on the front lines fighting for the earth that we all live on and the biodiversity that we cherish at these conferences. But they are like living in jail and they're not allowed to come and speak at these events.
Diamaga Marjong, Takilosi Tonga, Luchiku, Nationality, Tower, Diamamarjong, was at Sanjivani, Notabaki, Loni, Koritang, Tachika, Hibu, Lochinila, Kocha, Mambuchon, Taraki, Pony, Dolan, Kaja, and that the Dodon Rojimar saying that you got to Kori down. Message Nigachi, these chipped the Koran, Tamba was on Roba never chizate. Roba never theatre Kori Tachi Tana the Janaka Tachikan Torum Gochalan, the Rongasio, or the Nijin Robin Kori to Lamaja. The name Roba never che. They did Robin Sonela Toposon, Robin Chotela Toposon. 로빈 소합에 또 붙인 거 중에 디시는 거리다 거리사지 제사지나 데미 거라서 다시 어지가 당사다 다 마음받아 로바가 사는 때가 얘는 정고 거라서 문제가서 거라서 대시 제가 제대로 거리다 좀 뭐다 가져버려 거리가 니샤 냠들 사미제구나 저거를 다지
Chinese invasion came in 1950s, and China invaded fully Tibet since 1959. through occupation, invasions, and colonialize. Uh, so for the last 70 years, Chinese vast destructions of the Tibetan environment through the colonialized, through the oppressive, and also through the in environmental destructions. So if I give one example, it would be the nomads, as I mentioned earlier in my talk. The Chinese recently Chinese use the concept like different concepts like national park and like they use like different what you call colonialized language, colonialized knowledge productions. Through these kind of productions and through this kind of knowledge, uh, the large number of Tibetan nomads they need to resettle in the cities. They take the nomads' lands forcefully, and this is the biggest problem. And this like through the one work they do both of them, and so through these consequences, the nomadic life, the tradition also changes. So when the nomads resettled in the cities, they lost their land and they lost their traditional life. So due to all these reasons, the Tibetan nomadic families, as an individual, as a nomadic family, not only one or two, like thousands of Tibetan nomadic families are a problem. At the same time, the Tibetan nomadic lands also becomes like desert, and even the land and the people, both of them getting lots of problems.
전에 전에 네 그래서 성도 전에 야nak tonche churi kanyi zayda yanak lekshe ta ta kalak yanak wanje pe mi pope korig la jabe ono chonde tedi ngara ka tada lower tedi shetsa to ka konge korig ka ta de shenda 정선에 일단 먹는 자가 대시 제보고 싶은 일만 다다를 그냥 시작하다 가 한마디로 가서 로바가 사차되나 하고 그래 사차리 사마사마 내가 로바가 간데 마수 총총값 예민템이 침보 말해 말은 어디까라 뒤까지라 야nak 돈제를 주의 간이 싫어요 말 마수 사차로가 돈제를 주의 간이요 말 뒤까지라 야nak 반접제 보방 로그네 통해 참마 통하지 야nak 담덕제 저거는 지금 코릴라들이 막 쏘다 코릴라들이 가니까 뭐 얘는 막 나이나 tem상이나 낭미 다 직관적으로 정말 야nak 계속하는 정지 당자들이 이 낭미 교회 어디 약하자가 상막 강진아 강바 한 건이요 말 됐죠 이거가 로 얘는 따져가 약하다 이거 뭐네 강바지 한 막보다 기뻐요 근데 지금 코리 성마 따지고 약하게 나머지가 딱 맞아 이상의 요거는 막 통증을 다 하나 드리지 마시고 잡아지고 어떤 포치요 이 지네 여기다 마치 디쇼 거기 나바다 쳤고 딱 간딩만 보고 다 보세요 또 가. 또 정말 마음문에 개두문에 정바를 잡고도 나스쯤에 간이 다 디쇼 거리면서 나스 정바다 파일라 그래도 먹었지. 정바로 오거나 거리 때리게 타가 지금 들어있는 따뜻 맞춰 직찬이 반절 꺼냈다 자버리 니찬이 원샤게 땅이 요말 야나 그때 딱 거리 성격제야 다 참아다나 그 태블 그거는 보박 거리 성격제나 참 거지 보박 그렇게 소셔 샤당 따지 그러다 거기서 따지 성격제 야매 마스자 대어 데 간제고 참거제고 그 참거를 제로서 참거제라고 하지만 공주야 맞은 거 살아 참 거죠. 오하세입니다.
We have time, so I want to add one more thing. So recently, as I mentioned in my talk, I was born in nomadic family and nomadic society. I have full knowledge of the nomadic environment. So for the long time, we used to have clean air, clean atmosphere, and very clean environment. But recently, due to the Chinese migrations, large number of Chinese migration came into Tibetan grasslands, and so most of the Tibetan areas, not only the center Tibet, but even in my birthplace. So recently, there are lots of plastics and so many this kind of climate destructions also came in Tibet. And these things only came very recently, since a large number of Chinese migrations moved into Tibet. So I myself and other Tibetans, we try to protect to keep environment clean, to make the plastics and all these things clean. So but unfortunately, the protecting environment and protecting the rare species and animals are also illegal under the current Chinese regime. So even we have no place to tell to the government, to tell to the state that uh, even Pema also mentioned to protecting like the environment and protecting the clean and these atmospheres are also illegal.
Tene tat khori ga rachi soksha da so song che thko mare tene khori ga tari ga basora da so song che thko mare tene niwa te kare lo chang chana yami leshe pa de so dosa sacha che sa chama yong menda zong yong ko menda zong yong ta konju chepo che ta rada so sa te chene ta konju bear thong bear ke kher ke tami to so thama sa ja tene menda ga ju menda ta kher to so ta doba sa thama sa te chi ta 이 로 스팅다니 게 쳇데 말 사와서 성비 양 미경바 식적 양 다른 니가 말하지야 근데 짜사때 양 초라로 근데 양 총사는 게 멍보나 총고 근데 하나 또 또디 가를 된디 까쁘기 나나요 어때 다 맞고 미스터 제가 로미에라 제가 보스도 보고 다 계속 정말 장가서 뭐 맞고 팔제가 말 라마 사자리 다 지금 롱바리 롱화리 다 망보즈가 다 강망망 다 다치치 다치치 것이 다티 거리가 그런 건데 지금 가덤지야 거리도 지금 아주 지금 가르 쇼시가 지금 배야한테 야노좀 뒤뒤고 보사요 삼노시요 Digital, that consumption motion on Korea Boston all methods of drawbacks at my age. Low time, those have a matter of no some low need some sugar on that, sad no hollow, sad no hollow. Sad no hollow, the cherry to that, the Taka the Zero, Chicho no hollow show. That the Kana Yena decided to change. 견자 뭐 정어디다 맞추 초바지도 친구요 말다 맞추 다 간대 좀 먹고 근데 가 지금 늦게다 먼저 사차도 그거나 시바로 치고 사차도 나타로 좀 땅 그 맞추 사 걸로 때 오는다 하철 참아고 있이나 다리 먹다 다들 공원에만 맞추 냐지라 뒤에 단 데리고 모니터를 제가서 콜린다 담보 이제 뭐 마음만 단학 데이터 먹는데 최선이다 하나서 하나 딱좀딱 데리 딱 뜻처럼 그거는 소망보다 처먹어 너무 뜻들이 못했고 옛날에 딱 언론이 그러고라 벌써 용신인데 폰도 운영하는데 막 야나가 정말 전반만 보내지 거 너무 좋죠 다음 할체 태어나서 내가 망한 적 누워서 다 할체 다 태어나서 다음 용나 다 동하는 거야 돼다 태어나서 로사 줘야 돼 단도 로사 쳐요 다 동하는 로사 돼 다이 년대잖아 어떤 일을 했다고 빨리 항상 총산에 가서 말하는데 지금 워크 코리 니차 가이 리전 같은 마음으로 원대가 코리 같아서 내가 뭔가 생각 가서 디저트가 나도 말이야. 에지디 라마지 로디스 샤다 지금 총산에 샤나 마음으로. 그 재산에다 나버스 마음으로 통보하리. 총산에 야나도 관조를 주의 가이. 야나가 속소를 주의 가이. 야나가 리전을 주의 가이. 다 가이 그 법과 상황에서 또 벌써 영원서가 광 미생금, 정말 가니까 들이제 퇴체.
I will add one more thing. So, as we are discussing before, I mentioned before, in Tibet, even the environmental activists and the people who protect the environmentals, we are getting lots of problems. We have a lot of things to tell, like the minerals, the deforestations, and so many things happening in Tibet. These are the bigger issues. Even I want to give like very small example. So in recently in the many of you know that Tibetan grasslands are so green, so beautiful, and so these days like the rich and the rich Chinese people, they come to party on the grasslands, and what they do, they kill the rare species, the animals and which habited on the mountains for 1,000 years, and they kill that, and they eat, and then they drink beers, and they put and they play with bottles, like they put bottles and to shoot the bottles, and they put lots of bottles, and these things are also happening, and this kind of things happening, like they keep doing these things, like lots of bottles, the glasses on the ground. So these kind of things, and also like they are lots of pollutions, like glass pollutions and the plastic pollutions, and so many pollutions happening, and the one of the worst thing in recently, like Chinese, due to the industrial development in China, large number of productions. Now they're putting like lots of batteries, batteries in Tibetan grassland. They throw massive batteries in Tibetan grasslands. So these things also the big issues. So I and some of my friends, we wrote like few like applications to the Chinese authorities, and we didn't get a reply for the long time, and so finally they warned us that if you people do like such activities, you might go to in prisons or jails again. So from like this kind of very small examples, I have lots of things to tell. So at the same time, we can talk Tibetan environment in a very bigger sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for your responses. I want to turn it over now to the audience. If you have any questions, would anyone like to start?
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. You know, I, in my normal course of life, don't have a lot of access to world leaders, unfortunately. How can we most help you to get your story across?
Any other questions?
Hi there. I was interested in understanding a little bit more about the research side of the equation, because it feels like if you have more understanding of the true facts and figures around the challenges that are faced combating climate change in Tibet, you'd have more to say to those people who need to hear it. Are there any kind of like bright kind of stars on the horizon any options for getting more of that research done, or are there any organisations that can kind of help with that?
Thank you. Relating to the first question, how do we get the message across? I just happened to be speaking to a historian of economics from Glasgow University this afternoon, talking about China, and clearly there's a great sort of codependence between the developed world and China in many ways, economically. But if we're thinking about universities, for example, and thinking about how do we get the message across, should universities like Glasgow University be making more noise, for example, about the situation of Confucius institutes, which are really organs of the Chinese state, in the university? And for example, there's been a lot of noise in Germany in the last month, I think, because the Confucian Institute there was about to host a talk and it was closed down by some Chinese officials in Germany. So that's generated a lot of noise. But in that environment, should universities, for example, locally, Glasgow University, be making more noise about having a Confucius Institute in the university, in a famous university, and in a situation where there are lots of Chinese students coming to Glasgow University, which is potentially, of great benefit. There's maybe a certain economic codependence there as well. But I just wonder what you all think about the stance of academic institutions, towards China.
Take those three. Do you want to take another one?
Let's start with these three. Thank you so much, by the way. These were great questions. Anyone would like to answer one to begin with?
Thank you for really great and interesting questions. I would like to start with the last question raised about University of Glasgow. I think that universities play a very important role because these are the academic institutions that can generate critical discussions about the facts on the ground. We have students from different backgrounds, from different countries, with very unique perspectives from their own viewpoint about complex issues that we face in the world. So these are also difficult tasks for the professors as well, who have to, get many modules done, but many, critical issues emerge in the classrooms. But I will say that in the end, it has to be the values of the academia that has to be upheld. These are the students who will get doctorate degrees, who will uphold positions in elsewhere in the world, whether it's in corporations or NGOs or in the government. So when you have an awareness of issues that are very complex, but the discussions of which are held in a respectful way, then when these people go out in society in different roles, they can offer perspectives grounded in the complexity of the issue that is. So I think that universities can be a very crucial space for holding these discussions in a very respectful and democratic way, and also create connections between students who themselves suddenly find themselves in a new country, new education and cultural international environment, and are very unsure of finding their own peers and their own language of friendship and social circles. So I think that despite everything, these issues emerge in classroom, but universities can play a very important role. The other one about ordinary people's help in the Tibetan situation, I think, is really just parents telling their children about stories of Tibetans. I think it's very simple that stories pass on the knowledge onto children, and then encouraging reading Tibetan history, written by Tibetan. There are many Tibetan novelists and poets and artists, so that would be very useful. I think I'll pass on. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I think if you can look into the supporting organizations that are up here, we have websites. starting that conversation is a point that reaching out, I think, is a good part. We had in Collective in our campaigns, we have books that we've published. We there's grants that are being given out, and so sharing that with other Indigenous people that could take advantage of these opportunities. There's in Lineback we have an online university, Lineback University now. It's so going to the websites, seeing what works for you all, and sharing that, I think will really help us out. But to answer your question, like if you want to physically come to some of these places, there are a lot of resources out there of how to show up as a good relative, and I think you should all educate yourselves with that. And I don't find that it's my responsibility to tell you how that happens, but you all should do that amongst yourselves. There's a lot of material out there. There's a lot of books that are being read out there of how to show up as an ally and not take up space. Yeah, showing up. Don't be racist. That's a good tip. Simple as that. The one thing I try to tell people is like, in this time, this day and age, we can't win without you, and you can't win without us. So we really all need to be on the same page.
Everyone learned something really important here today, racism. I think the question about the research, I guess I would just touch on really quickly. I think one of the most challenging things about the Tibet Climate Crisis, which is kind of what I was touching upon with the two-sided of like climate change impacting colonization and also colonization impacting climate change, is that right now inside Tibet, like we've actually, heard just a few minutes ago at our other side event from researchers, glaciologists, scientists who say that like there is virtually no access to Tibet, even for scientific purposes. And I think that's part of the climate that the Chinese Communist Party, the regime, has created inside of Tibet and they're actually spreading around the world. And those are actually, that question I think is actually very related to the question about Confucius Institutes as well, because I think that the fact that, and it's also related to the first question, I think listen to the leadership of young people from impacted communities like Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Uyghurs that are undergoing genocide, and the fact that many of the green and institutions that have solar panels, they don't check, and many of these solar panels are actually created by Uyghur forced labor. You guys should look into it. There's the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor, I think, has done a little bit of work on that as well. But many of today's solar panels are created by forced labor by Uyghurs that are facing genocide. But I think it's all like extremely interlinked, because if you were, not so that you're not, but if you were a true ally, you would listen to the voices of the impacted communities, of indigenous leaders, of Tibetan youth. And I've not really met a Tibetan young person who said, actually, the Confucius Institute is a great program. Let's totally have funding from Chinese Communist Party on our campus. Every single, without like any pretty much exception, young person that I've met that's a Tibetan, whatever of their place on the political spectrum is, agrees that it is absolutely inappropriate, triggering, offensive, and dangerous to have Chinese government money on their campus. And that's not just for Tibetans, but also for Chinese students and international students, because there's been many links that actually, government documents that have proven that many of these Chinese government entities funding, funnels of money are connected to the local consulates and embassies, and they use those as ways to even spy on students that are studying abroad. And this can't be proved at every single campus, so I'm not trying to, create like a witch hunt for trying to figure out, who's the spy. But all I'm saying is that these programs like create platforms on these campuses for a murderous genocidal regime, and that just doesn't feel appropriate, especially if the impacted communities all seem in consensus that it's not appropriate. So it's like one way that you can be an ally, and also those programs create perpetuate and further spread the climate of stifling academic freedom and creating barriers to academic freedom, where it says like, okay, if you want to do research in this one region, then you must condemn Dalai Lama, or you must do this, or you must silence the event on this topic. And I think that the biggest risk that the global community faces is allowing China to put those pressures on yourself. So like the scientific community, if they say, okay, we need to access this research just so important that we're willing to, you know, pass on just a couple of small moral issues, this just kind of starts to snowball. And it becomes a situation where like a climate dystopia where those with access to privilege and those with access to education, those from the global north really, are using their privilege to further oppress colonized peoples for the sake of climate change. So now climate change and fighting climate change becomes another reason to further silence and oppress marginalized people. So what are you really fighting for? Humanity or to save yourself? And I think that's like kind of the question. Like, do we want to fight this disease created by colonialism together, or do we want to further divide ourselves and say we will allow marginalized people to continue to suffer, and we're doing it for the greater good? And you know, you're just greenwashing the continuation of colonialism. So I think that's like the answer to the question about science.
나는데 콘서가 복잡하다. 실제 배시 뭐 여러분들 안에 알아다 먹고다 알아다 지금 뭐 고집 손. 데이데 다 콘심나 콘서 뭐치랑 그게 콘서 당면지 되잖아. 그 시그 더 집거든요. 그 로직이랑 거래. 옛날에 콘서가 가서다 야나가 나왔다 쳐오는데 콘서가 그런 거 락식거리다 많이 뭐치고 당에 그런 락식이라 먹어요. 계속 배치적입니다. 그래서 뭐치랑 그다 머리랑 그다도 배치적 거지네. 다 지금 잠만 그 여러 다 알수의 망보스가 코로나스 다 지금 왕제스지야도 삼로 왕제지야 차차 뒤위에 그것도 좀 콘서가 다들 콘서 뭐치랑 다 배치고 다 지금 야미 의정부 실제로 잔서 멤버가 단마자 지금 잔서지네 소야제 다들 의정 잔서죠. 실제로 뭐네 다 보는 보다 우거다 또 그런 거는 얘기잖아요. 단단히 안랑 데이터다 보다 가지 보잖아. 보그 가이드나 데다 럼바니바 당고 고서 토닥거나. 근데 곰바가 오이제 남한테 자나 잡게 보이스. 오이제 남한테 자나 잡게 제사 제나 가르치는 게 거래. 콘센당 자나 잡 제나 맞이나 콘센 나오게 보이스. 콘센 나오다 자 남한테 제사 로고 아니야. 요사 로고. 출게 메는 그 다 출르기냐 냐도 따또 모제지나 그런 거 지르정 잡는 제 때 알아 이카요 여관도 전에 야노찬데 제르죠. 야노찬 제사테니 또 다들 카스 거지나 콘센트를 듣고 콘센트를 남도 지금 콘센트를 이제 보고 콘센트를 지금 메는 거죠. 다들 할때서 맨날 내봐서 근데 또 못하더래 남도 다다 좀 럼바니아 같은 거지 야가까지 근데 또 가는 데가 남까지인데 워처 카메다 자르 점심 근데 하나 파마에서 다 버글에서나 디까마니 있음 티와다 버글에 같이 잡거든 파마고 야미 같이 다음 로바데 워크 메시는 저 약간 메시 빼 먹어요 에디 약간 메시는 먹어서 그다래 이 버거스라 내주가 떠다가 가는 거 아니 다 과학적으로 다들이 하나 상황 가벼 먹고 싶어 다 저도 매 시작교대 공적을 복잡해 실제 그 여러 당 다 알아들어서 뭐냐잖아 야나가 루역 가서 야나가 루정 찾지 뭐냐 뭐네 니가 라나라 루정 랑티한테 내리 루정 아마스도다 너무 어정 항상 맞죠 매장 레이먼도 되게 라원한데 코로나 루정도 삼로 찬들이 통보지요. 다 필요한마도 가면은 그래서 여러 단에서 가지 못하게 와가지고 로직 시즌 때는 다른 말에 가성비를 활용 다르도 있다. 최소한 여러 단에서 단 야나 그 루정 코토즈가 뭐 거리 다이잖아. 또뭐 탈게 없고 뭐지?
I will will focus on the Confucius Institute and the recently Chinese soft power, and especially the open like Confucius institute in various universities in US, Europe, and especially England and Scotland. So when we think about the Confucius, Confucius is the one of the greatest philosopher in China, and his life, what we call his what we call his life. He gave lots of the moral values and virtues that towards the positive way, and but in Confucius Institute, and especially what CCP doing in the Western world is not what the Confucius itself taught and his philosophy. But recently, the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) they tried to spread the nationalism through the Confucius. So even the tactics and strategies changes a lot. During the many years, they burned the Confucius books. But recently, since Xi Jinping, they use the Confucius as spread the nationalism, especially in the Western world. So, and I quote it as cultural colonized, Chinese culture colonized in the free world or the Western world. So the same thing is happening in Tibet. Recently, Chinese use the bilingual policies in Tibet, and they try to use the Chinese language as a medium of instruction, and they always try to give a small space or lack of space to use the Tibetan language in the schools. And the other thing is they want to change the Tibetan Buddhism change into the communism. So this is the very dangerous thing in the recent years. I call this as a cultural genocide. Why communists is an atheist, so they have no any spiritual, they have no religion. While they want to change Tibetan Buddhism into communism. So this is the another shift of cultural genocide or cultural assimilation. Then I also talk about the language. Especially recently since 2010, especially most of the Tibetan parts, they use the language policies from the infant section. So from the infant section, middle schools, high schools, in these schools, the Tibetan kids, they are not allowed to talk in Tibetan. They are not allowed to teach the Tibetan language. So many of the Tibetan nomads and especially Tibetan farmers, they are getting lots of problems. They send the kids to the school, and in the school they need to talk in Chinese. When the nomads or the Tibetan rural farmers, if they go to school to take the kids, they don't know the Chinese language, and they are getting lots of challenges. They are getting lots of challenges of the language itself. So language assimilation is also the big issue. And as I mentioned, so the Chinese colonized cultural influence, cultural or the nationalist what we call policies in Western world, we should stop it. So the Confucius institutions, I think we should to work on these issues, and we need to think very through different perspectives.
Time for one more?
answer to the research bit.
Sorry, Trudy, can you use the hand up? The other one go through the live stream.
I see, right, okay, thank you. The research side of climate crisis is really challenging. So you can imagine that if Tibet was an independent country, they would be doing its own, national determined contributions. So you see how complicated it is. But despite that, there has been an excellent report published by the Cross-Party Group for Tibet, in fact, which is at the Scottish Parliament. They have carried out in-depth compilation of just so many researches that has been published so far. So I think that is a very excellent, it's an excellent example of how, groups which can still care about Tibet can, do research and compile facts and figures that are already out there. Another thing is that, so you have this institution called ICIMOD, which is they do a lot of research on the mountain regions. They can play a very important role in creating connections between Tibetan experts, Tibetan social scientists, and creating just cross collaborations between the downstream scientists as well as the other scientists in the world in researching about climate, just statistics. There is a lack of scientific data in Tibet. There is already a lot available, but because climate crisis is getting worse and worse, there needs to be better and more transparent collaboration between scientists at every level. So yeah, I think that's my answer. Okay.
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, I think so. Do you still want to ask me a question? Yeah.
I'm nervous. I'm grateful to have heard all of you speak, and I feel very moved that I've been here in Glasgow for COP, and I've listened to a lot of people, not in COP, but all the others that have come because of the crisis, because of the emergency. And what I hear is that the developed countries they are the ones who have brought people here together and given a voice maybe at a table, but they don't know what is going on for the people that are not in the developed countries, and that what is going on for the people that are not in the developed countries is that they do not have the kind of education, the kind of politics, the kind of economics, the kind of social awareness to allow their people en masse to understand. Plus, they don't have an economic interest in freeing their cultures enough from consumerism. So the natural world, the people in the rest of the world outside of the capitalist centers, they are too repressed, but they are the ones who live with Mother Earth. They are the ones who live closest. And they are the ones who really know what is going on and what is in crisis and what is really being lost. Because the ones in the West, they don't live there and they don't really know what's being lost. So I would ask the ones who live close to the earth, what would you like to say in this forum for the Western ones to hear from being close to the earth and being people who represent the earth? What would you want to tell us? Even if it isn't a solution, even if it's just a comment that you want to express.
anyone like to start?
Just seems like I'm closest to her. Anyway, well, so His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, the spiritual and political, the then spiritual and political leader of Tibet, he said, develop the heart. You know, so much has been spent on developing just many other things, but we need to develop the heart. And as much as archaic it seems to put it that way at COP26, I think there's a profound message in that, you know, money really has no inherent value. We need to really rethink the value systems in the world that we live in, which is just entrenched in colonialism, capitalism, and just the state of the economy that we live in. And I think it also falls upon Tibetan ourselves too to think, you know, how we can navigate this really challenging world. So I think it really comes down to really thinking that we live in a deeply interconnected world, and climate crisis is something that affects us all. And one effect felt in mining in indigenous lands somewhere else on the land will affect others too. So I think, as long as Dalai Lama puts it, you know, developing the heart. He himself had been exiled at a very difficult point of life. As much as he's a spiritual, he's also a human being, and you know, he had to navigate all of it through just a really big shift of geopolitical power. So I think there's a profound message there.
I would have to say indigenous lands back in indigenous hands. And we can show you how it's done.
Yes.
I mean, if you want some guidance, stop a pipeline.
Yeah.
So start from there.
I would just say that I think they should start seeing and accepting the interconnectedness of the world, because, I mean, even if that's not their belief spiritually, it's a reality when it comes to climate change, and that's just a fact. It's just a scientific fact that what happens in one part of the earth will in fact change the outcome of someone else's life somewhere else. And despite all the money that developed nations may hold in their hands, all of the resources and capital, that's not going to save them at this point, because we all share one earth and there are no more planets for sale, so they have to rely on this one. And I think the only way they can expect a healthy future for their children, their grandchildren, and the future generations of their nations is by actually accepting the fact that every place in the earth is interconnected, and actually taking that promise to protect your future generations seriously. And hopefully the greed of like the selfishness of the concern for their own children can also be a motivator for them to respect the people that steward other lands.
다른 말은 냐제 부분은 어떻게 되거나 consular 문에 지금 함심을 하신 거 고릴라도 좀 뭐지 뭐 그러자든 참하고 터문 거 가지고 그래 뭔 지금 레와다 터문 거 밸런스 잡잖아도 거기 고닥고 그런다 야 마콘도가 제주님 거기 고고지 삼거다 야 거기 마콘도 제주 빼긴 거 같은 있었네.
So we are talking about the developments and developing countries. From my perspective, so we have only one globe and we have only one home. So we are not the or one big family. And so either it's politicians or U.S. president or anyone who is in the politicians or policymakers or as a general common people. So we all are same human beings, and what we are getting problems in contemporary issues, especially the climate crisis. From my perspectives, we need to urge, we need to request, and we need to keep pressing to the policymakers and also the developing countries and all these things. They even we talk, we shout loud. Sometimes they try not to hear, but we keep pressing, keep requests, and keep talking all these issues, and hopefully we can save this climate emergency.
Thank you so much for your questions. I think we're a little bit over the time now, so I'm gonna have to wrap it up, unfortunately. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. It was truly an honor to have you all tonight, and thank you again to the audience for joining us, for asking amazing questions, for paying attention, for being here. Simply, truly thank you. And thank you to our interpreter, Dr. La. To close our program for the evening, I'm just going to ask Pema Yokola to offer some katas to all of our panelists as a sign of respect. Pema Yokola is the president of the Tibetan community in Britain, and she was here to support us for the events, but also was here at the march with her team, who brilliantly led the march despite the terrible weather. So thank you for that. I think I will never forget the strength and resilience we all showed yesterday. That was all thanks to you and your energy.
On behalf of the Tibetan community in Britain, I would like to thank this amazing panel and to the organisations who brought this together. We are a small Tibetan community in exile. We are about 800 to 900 Tibetans across the UK. And I think about 40 Tibetans ended up coming here to Glasgow over the weekend, who were super inspired to meet these fantastic young leaders, as well as meeting Golok Jigme, who has inspired us since he was in Tibet, to simply speak out or question policies that govern their own lives, literally put you in prison, put you in torture, and for many in death. So absolutely brave. And for us, Tibetans, we are deeply indebted and grateful for the sacrifices and the continued commitment in a free world to use these democratic tools to he finally has democratic tools that he can use and come to these platforms. It means so much to us when these spaces do not exist in Tibet. So first of all, I'd like to thank Golok Jigme for okay. And then I would also like to thank Sai and the NBN Collective. I'll put this with. Through my activist life, in Students for a Free Tibet, where I was previous director, and he's basically half of my activist life. I've known Sai because he's helped train, educate us in activism, from art, creative art, through climbing, direct action, strategic non-violent directives. He has been there for the many young Tibetans across the US, and we've tried to bring him to Europe and different places, and it's amazing to see you here with us once again as an amazing ally. Also, again, to the intern, Julia, for her first panel, and it's the first time I've met her. Came from France. Yeah. So amazing. I thought it was really impressive, and it's great to see the new generation of Tibetans, so smart and of course our experts, Julia, also fantastic. I've learned so much from you over the week. Please continue your hard work and contribution. Amazing young leader, leading Students for a Free Tibet and inspiring so many young Tibetans across the world. She's been, she's worked, Beijing, China is hosting the Olympics, and the Winter Olympics. So they just did their launch of they did that ceremony in Greece where they put the torch and everything. So she was there campaigning for like 2 weeks, direct action, flying over to now Glasgow, doing the COP26 non-stop. Because we don't have that many people in the Tibetan freedom movement. We are a small community in exile, and we rely on such energy, activism. So thank you, Pema, for all the hard work you're doing around the clock. To the translator. Rising star in the Tibetan community. First time doing translation. You're amazing. Coming to you.
I don't know what else to say. Thank you so much, Bella. Yes, so I think this is the end. Thank you so much for coming again. There's still food, I think, outside. So if you would like to, no. Oh my Lord. Well. Sorry. But we're still around for drinks if you'd like to chat with us and our panelists. Thank you again so much, and hopefully see you all soon. Good job.